problem is to suppose that a single agent is in charge of a bunch of people and kind of sets the game, because it's a natural way of thinking about contracting when there's a dictator or someone who actually has control over people that are working under them. And so that's what's motivating this lecture now. I'm going to talk about optimal contracting and how to estimate those kinds of models and some of the issues that you run into when you do that. So to kick things off, I want to describe a very simple moral hazard problem and then show what's identified and how you might think about going to estimate it. Then we'll kind of jump forward to putting this in the context of something that's dynamic, where a manager or a CEO or shareholders, actually shareholders, decide what the optimal contract is for the model environment that we've got, how to estimate that model, and actually show you some of the estimates that come out of one such model. So imagine we've got a risk neutral principal and also a risk averse agent. Principal is employing the agent. There is output, we'll call it X, and the principal is going to get X minus whatever he she pays for to the agent. The probability distribution of X, this output, depends on what the agent does. The two actions of the agent has a preferred action that he she would take if they were paid a constant wage. In other words, in a situation in which output did not depend on effort. It's surprisingly relevant in today's world, where there have been calls for managers to get paid a flatter wage, in the sense that, in particular, that they shouldn't be paid exorbitant amounts for what they do. And here I'm more or less quoting media as opposed to giving my own opinions, for what they do, and therefore they should get less. And in a competitive world, of course, that would also mean that they would probably get a higher base, and we'll talk about that base level, maybe not today, but at some point, maybe in the conference, for sure. So the question is, what would happen if they were paid a flat wage or something approaching that? It's a natural comparative dynamic to think about. In this setup, the agent can decide to seek employment elsewhere, like becoming an academic, or retire. And we're just normalizing that option at 0. Again, not an entirely unrealistic scenario, because the fact of the matter is that quite a few graduates from Carnegie Mellon, at least, do go into private enterprise and are quite successful there. Or they could accept the principal's offer. And at that point, after making the principal's, if they accept the principal's offer, well, then they decide whether they're going to work. And then the other action, I'm calling it shirking, but those are just two names, okay, to reflect what I was talking about before. The principal observes whether they're employing the person or not, of course, but not the agent's work effort. And anybody who's renovated their house, and I realize this applies more to the faculty than the students, will know what I mean when I say how hard it is to observe effort by people that you employ on a contract. The rest of you will find out soon enough. After if the revenue is realized, the principal pockets the difference. In this case, static model X minus WX. So the density function conditional on the agent working is F. And the density function conditional on the agent shirking is G times F. So G obviously is the likelihood ratio of shirking density on working density. And of course, if you're thinking about how you should pay this person, given that you don't observe the effort of the agent, that likelihood ratio G is going to be pretty important in thinking about the compensation schedule you give them. Unfortunately, you don't see what the person does, but you do get to see X, and then you can compute F on G at that FG, well, you can compute G of X at that point because you know the model just as well as we do. And in that sense, you would expect the compensation schedule in this optimal contract to reflect something about what would happen when the agent shirks. In other words, the compensation schedule is going to tell you something about what would have happened in the counterfactual of the agent shirking. Okay. Notice how the optimality of the contract is being brought to bear in a very heavy way on what goes on outside of equilibrium behavior. If you're not going to use theory to talk about what's going on off the equilibrium path, what are you going to use? Maybe institutional stuff will help, but those are the kinds of choices that you face when you move off what we'll call the data generating process. Okay, so expected value from working, of course, in this whole setup is going to be greater if the agent works and shirks. That's the whole point of setting up a conflict between these two. That would lead us to half the conflict. And so that inequality reflects the preference for the principle for working over shirking. Now notice, well, I'll get to that in a minute. So we got an inequality there coming straight off that we're going to look at later on. The agent's going to be an expected utility maximized with exponential utility function. You can see to the e to the minus rho w there. Now, the exponential utility assumption is also kind of useful in this context because we'll see that under those kind of, with that kind of assumption, we will not have to, combined with something else about markets, we will not have to estimate the agent's discount factor in a dynamic setup. You know how yesterday, I think almost, well, not Whitney's original one, but all the other sessions had this sum of beta to the t, u, t, where beta is something that wasn't identified, at least off the data generating process. Well, with an exponential utility function, that's going to wash out in this dynamic context. It's obviously got some problems in the sense that we're assuming absolute risk aversion, regardless of the agent's wealth. So you wouldn't want to make that kind of assumption if you're dealing with people with this very different kind of wealth backgrounds. On the other hand, you might be able to think about it if you were able to stratify populations and estimate different discount factors for different people. But that's where that partly why that exponential utility aspect is in there. I haven't really focused on the dynamic part yet, but I will. There's a rho coefficient that we're going to have to try and get at, and that's going to pose an issue in the estimation. The alpha and beta are parameters that represent an agent's preference for shirking or working relative to their outside opportunity. Notice that first term doesn't have a coefficient on it, and that's to reflect the fact that they get something out there which is going to consist of income and utility from somewhere else. And if we had information about what they would do aside from this job, well, we would want to use that because that would provide something about the alternatives that they face and hence what kind of job they might take, especially if it changed around a bit. And when we get to the dynamic stuff in a few minutes, we will see that being able to switch jobs around actually is going to provide some variation in the data that we can use. People facing different job opportunities in this kind of world are facing different types of pay lotteries, wage lotteries. And they're thinking about, well, do I want to take the risk of this or that? Well, that's going to help us identify the risk aversion coefficient, of course. So here's a static model where that's not going to really play that much role. The agent prefers shirking, in other words, doing what he wants to do relative to what the firm wants him to do, or the principal wants him to do. And yet the principal prefers working to shirking. And that's where this conflict of interest arises. That's why we need an optimal contract that kind of gears the output to the principal's goals. So in other words, if the principal only wanted the agent to mind the shop, winter, Dalmatian coast, then you can pay them a constant wage and they keep the house from being inhabited by refugees. And then a little bit edgy. Whereas Boston. And then in summer, on the other hand, you really care about being able to rent the place and keeping it in good condition. And in that situation, you would probably be paying the agent according to how well they do. Okay. So it's not, I'm not even arguing that shirking is a bad thing. Sometimes that's exactly what you want to do. But then we'll see in a minute that if you're just getting the agent to just mind the shop, then you just pay him a constant wage, no problem. And we could exploit that too, because we'd see in some phases constant wage, other times wage going up and down. That would tell us something a little bit about alpha and beta as well. Okay, so that's another source of identification that you could possibly use, not here, but in a sort of a relatively straightforward extension of what I'm explaining now. But let's stick to the basics for a minute. So if you want the agent to work, and that's the only situation in which this is really useful, shouldn't quite say that, because if you only want the guy to shirk, well, actually, this model devolves right back to a standard Roy model in labor economics. So let's not discount it completely. So if you want the agent to work as opposed to shirk, then first of all, you've got to make sure he turns up. Second of all, you've got to give him a contract that rewards him enough when it's that he will actually prefer working to shirking. Okay, and so first one's called participation constraint, second one incentive compatibility constraint, and this goes right back to, I think John was mentioning, auction design, some of the work that Meyerson did on generalized revelation principles. This is exactly a derivative of that kind of setup, and more actually closer, if we're thinking about what's the minimal cost of achieving these two things, goes back to Oliver Hart and Sandy Grossman, okay, who have a famous paper on this. So while I'm at it, the exponential utility function goes back to Ben Holmstrom in this setup, because Holmstrom, Milgram, and forgot the other name, were amongst the people that showed that in this situation, well, because wealth doesn't count in the optimal contract that we're going to get, if we made this contract dynamic, sequence of short-term contracts will still be optimal. Okay. So Freudenberg. So here are the two constraints. Principal solves this problem, and we're going to minimize the expected costs of employing the agent to work hard. We could that would be the cost minimization part of this problem. Okay. So we'll do a simple transformation of just taking what we'll call the utility component of wages, that's the V of X, sort of turning it into something that's a little easier to handle, perhaps. And when you do that, that minimization problem turns into a maximization problem. And not only that, it's concave with linear constraints. So for each X, you simply ask, what is the V that you should pick? That's the way to think about it calculus-wise. And when you do that, you get from the first order equation solving through for the what we'll call the ratio of what turn out to be Kuhn-Tucker multipliers, that equation at the bottom. It's a unique positive solution. Now, the reason why you get that solution in this case is because first you show that it is optimal to impose it in the solution. It is optimal, in the solution to this problem, both the participation constraint and the incentive constraint are met with equality. And that simplifies this problem, okay? In a dynamic setup where one period contracts are not optimal, not all of those constraints are met with equality, and that really starts to mess things up a little bit. But in the simplest case, that's what we get. And you can, if you stare long enough at this thing, you can see how the contract, well, there are some parts that are really easy. It depends on the G of X. Where are we? There we are, G of X, okay? And if you were thinking that for the most part, G of X was declining, because the idea is, doesn't have to be monotone decreasing or anything like that, that's not a requirement. But if it was kind of going down more or less over the X, well, then you would be seeing that the compensation would be increasing in X. Okay, see the 1 plus there too as well. The log of 1, remember, is 0. So that's giving you some sense of what that contract looks like. Now, to make that, to formalize this a little bit more, what I'm going to assume in this setup is that in the limit, as X goes to infinity, G of X goes to 0. In other words, a truly extraordinary performance could not have been produced by Shirky. So it's a limit, no more than that. We're not assuming monotonicity. One of the reasons why people main reason why people assume monotonicity in this literature is because they're looking at marginal changes and they're looking at a first order condition. And so that's why they need that monotonicity. And one of the reasons I'm not looking at monotonicity, we're not looking at monotonicity in this setup, is because then we'd be trying to estimate this model on the basis of infinitesimal changes in what the agent does. And with the kind of data that you have, there's a real issue here as to whether you want to exploit first order conditions or whether you want to exploit something that's a little bit more like a hammer on a pin. And so we've chosen the latter, and hopefully we get something out of it. So with perfect monitoring.
Well, there's a question about whether the alpha 2 is a typo in the first equation.
Yes, it is. Thanks. Let's go back to where it is on page.
It's right there.
Next page.
Next page. Yep. Alpha 2 should be just alpha, because I tried to switch all to make the notation consistent across the various papers. Alpha means you work hard. Beta means you shirk. And so it was a typo, leave it at that. Okay. Where are we? There's an issue here as to, did we get to there? Yeah. Thanks, Bill. How do you think about moral hazard in this kind of setup? Natural question to ask. One measure is to say, well, how much would the principal have to pay the agent if there was perfect monitoring? In other words, how much are you willing to pay to get rid of this moral hazard problem altogether? Okay. And we do this all the time. We have the government interfere with regulations and whatever to kind of make it harder for people to mess up privately. And if there was less government there, well, then that would be more up to private arrangements to deal with that. Okay, so this is one side of the, and companies do that all the time too. They ask themselves, I ask myself, how much do I want to piss off my builder to try and make him work the way I want him to work? These are kind of, is obviously a dynamic question at that point, because then I have to worry about what's going to happen the next day, sort of thing. But these kinds of things happen all the time. I mean, it has been said that faculty set exams to try and set incentives for students to work, as opposed to students themselves wanting to take exams to give them this kind of discipline. So we have these kinds of sort of contractual arrangements of different sorts all the time. So one way of measuring this is, if we could all see everything, how much would we save? Against that, there are two other measures that reflect the private, and that measure, of course, is the amount you have to pay them. WX minus what you would have to pay if you only had to satisfy the participation constraint. In other words, you ask yourself, what would you have to pay if you wanted to satisfy the participation constraint? You go back to the participation constraint here. You can see straight off that that's what it would involve. And so here's what you'd have to pay to just satisfy the participation constraint. Here's the extra you have to pay, that's difference, if in fact you have to satisfy the incentive compatibility constraint as well. Next measure is, what about the agent's non-pecuniary? How important is this conflict? What is the agent's non-pecuniary benefit from shirking? Well, that's just this monetized value of this ratio between alpha and beta. And that comes straight from thinking about the exponential utility function, bringing the alpha up to the top in the exponential term, and then you have to worry about the rho bit. That's all that is, piece of algebra. And the last thing is, what is the gross loss to the principal from the agent shirking instead of working? In other words, how much does the principal really care about the agent working versus shirking? Those are things that we'd like to get an empirical handle on, because they're relevant kinds of questions that we would like to be able to answer if we think about how companies, public corporations, and a whole lot of other contracts should be regulated or not. So let's think about how you would start estimating this model. Well, before you even think about estimating, let's start thinking about what's identified in this model. We've got a probability distribution for the person working, the likelihood ratio for shirking versus working. We've got these two taste parameters, and we have a risk aversion parameter. How do we estimate all those things? We have a panel data set which shows the XN and the WN, compensation and output. Say it could be cross-sectional, could be longitudinal, no aggregate shocks, no changes in technology. So either is good. And in this setup, we'll imagine that the wage is measured, or the compensation is measured with some kind of error. So we're making a really simple assumption about why W of X is not actually observed, but only W of X plus epsilon, where epsilon is a disturbance, okay? IID and uncorrelated with everything else. Now, it's easy enough to test whether W of X is constant or not. Okay, is there variation in X, or does W vary with X or not? And of course, if we were taking this to managerial compensation, where I will point out later that 20% of the time, CEOs get negative compensation when it's measured properly. That is less than zero, substantially less than zero. That's a teaser for Friday, Saturday, whenever. So they have huge variation in their compensation.
I feel so sorry for them.
Yeah, I know, John. Calm down. That's what you're.
Welfare for CEOs, I think.
Okay, I'll add that to the 1.5 hours. Panel data. I'm from a business school.
Compensation.
Panel data. Okay, W and XN. So we've only got to the W of X is identified straight off essentially by assumption, because we've got this IID disturbance. F of X is identified straight off because we see the X's, and hence we can work out what F is. So there's nothing in that. There's really the only things that we have to identify are G of X, that likelihood ratio is associated with shirking versus working, and the two taste parameters, as well as the risk aversion parameter.
Sorry, it's a very basic question.
Yeah, sure.
So I didn't understand how F of X identified. Do you see the CEO working or shirking? So then how do you know the agent generated from?
Yeah. If the agent is shirking, then the optimal contract is to pay the agent a constant wage. We can see that.
During the period of
Yeah, that's right. And so we're looking at the summer months, because in the summer months on the Dalmatian Coast, variable wage. In the winter months, flat. So they must be shirking then and working in the other. So the point is that everyone knows what the overall primitives are. They understand when they're going to want shirking versus working and go from there.
So
Okay.
Follow that.
Yep.
So we're going to take the data from the winter months and then.
Okay, if we had the data on the winter months, that would help us. In this setup, we only have data on the summer months. We're going to actually apply it to managerial compensation. None of these CEOs get paid a constant wage. Now, I am suggesting that if we had data on the winter months as well, then we'd have more information, and so we'd be able to utilize that. But in this setup, we don't. And so we're stuck with looking at, I should have said, perhaps to make it clearer, not just XN and WN, but I should have put comma and they're working.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So do we know, like this setup, do we take into account that the agents are optimizing for the principles optimization problem?
Yes. The agent is maximizing their utility given the contract that they face, and the participation constraint ensures that they want to sign up. It's in their best interest to sign up. And the incentive compatibility constraint ensures that they want to work versus shirk. Okay. So in this setup, the principal sets the game, sets the rules. The agent sees the rules and then decides what they're going to do. Both parties optimizing. Okay. So that is a framework about the simplest framework you can imagine in this kind of.
I can also ask it in a different way. Same time T, like they play the game.
Yep.
Then the next period, can the principal then update the contract?
Okay, yes. And this comes back to a comment I made a little earlier about Freudenberg, Holmstrom, and Milgram. In this setup, if we generalize it in the simplest possible way by just having repeats of these, then a one-period contract repeated is optimal. In other words, a long-term contract with reputation effects or whatever cannot improve upon this. In other words, there's no reputation to be had. Now, if we change the setup, so for example, the principal doesn't know what the agent's ability is to begin with, that, or perhaps no one knows what the agent's ability is to begin with, and the agent, and then we have, and that affects output, then we actually have scope for something called a long-term contract that will deliver a higher expected output to the principal than a sequence of short-term contracts. In other words, if you want to have a long-term contract in your model, you need to set up primitives so that a short sequence of short-term contracts is not optimal. Okay, and in this framework, you can't do it even just by repeating. We'll see that in a minute. Okay, keep going. Yeah. What if the risk parameter was 9? What could we say under those circumstances? I'm going to come back. Obviously, we don't know what the risk parameter is, but what if it was not? Okay. Well, we can look at the first order equation again, first order condition, and we get this, where we exploit this condition that as output goes up a long way, the firm does really, really well. The manager's wealth does not go up a huge amount. They only get, taking John's sympathy into account, millions as opposed to billions, which is what people like Musk, entrepreneurs make. They make billions. Managers merely make millions. So in this setup, although we're not assuming concavity, we are assuming there is a limit out there, and we're exploiting that limit. Okay, and so that's the sense in which that is identified. Okay, or that's what we're assuming. Not assuming. That's what we're assuming. It's identified. I mean, you could make a stronger assumption to put it on finite support or something like that. I don't think it's necessary. So if that is, given that that's true for this model, well, then we can see that this thing goes to 0 as x goes up. And so we get V upper bar there. And so we get something to say what V upper bar looks like. And if you put these two, if you put this equation together with the same equation, but evaluated when x goes to infinity, well, then you get this result here that says that g of x, the likelihood ratio, is just equal to this algebra. It's about less than half a page of derivation. Okay, nothing. Now, we can show that the participation incentive compatibility constraints both bind. And so the participation constraint binding is dead easy, because you're thinking, I can always reduce the compensation that I pay this guy a flat amount, okay, regardless of what happens. And so it must bind, otherwise I can reduce it further. So it's straightforward to show that the participation constraint binds, and it's not that hard to show that the incentive compatibility constraint binds as well. And so we now got essentially 3 equalities here, given the risk aversion parameter, okay? And let's move on one more. So with a risk aversion, we've got alpha and beta and G identified for a given risk aversion parameter. So if all we were using were cost minimization, we could rationalize any risk aversion parameter greater than 0, and then form these quantities like that. And and then show that the beta is less than the alpha, and the G integrates to 1 when it's defined this way, and that it's always positive. In other words, we would be able to show that alpha, beta, and G for any row was a specification for this problem that was observationally equivalent to the true specification, where true means the model has a given row, and then as a result of that has a given alpha, beta, and G. Okay, so is that clear to you? That we can show that alpha is greater than beta. In other words, shirking is better than working. We can show that G is a well-defined likelihood ratio because it integrates to 1 and it's positive all over the place. And it's also going to satisfy that property that G goes to 0 as X gets big. And hence we can take any row and say, well, okay, for any row, we have a well-defined problem, cost minimization problem, in which the W and X that you get out of this generating process, this data generating process, the WX process, is the same for all these different rows. That's what we mean by observational equivalence in this setting. Okay? So we'd like to go a little bit further than that. In response to a couple of questions, one from Nikhil, we have the WX is more profitable than paying the agent a shirking wage. So we have one inequality here that is actually helping us, because we got to pick rows so that this equation is also satisfied. Okay, and then plugging in our formulas for alpha, beta, and G, that is just like this. Okay, and if you look at this inequality, you can see that we're just we've got observables in here, covariance with respect to the X's and the W's. Okay, all of this is from the data generating process. So we get from this an inequality that says, okay, it's not any row that satisfies this. The rows also have to satisfy that. That implies the alpha, betas, and G's have to satisfy just for those kind of rows. And then we can go from there. And you might say, oh my God, what's he talking about? This leads to a whole ton of things. Don't despair, guys. Don't despair. I can tell you're weeping. Because if we go back to I wanted to find those 3 measures things, okay? We go back to those 3 measures and we say, let's look at all those rows, okay? Look at all those rows, plug them in here. That's going to give us, we got set identification for the rows, right? But that's going to give us set identifications for the tau 1, tau 2, and tau 3 as well, right? So we still get information about the things that we want to do with this model when we're thinking about running comparative statics, even though we only have set identification. And so I think that's an important point or an example to sort of motivate, I think you guys, myself maybe, to take set identification pretty seriously, rather than impose additional assumptions that you might feel uncomfortable with in order to get something more what you think is precise when you run the risk of bias. Okay. Well, that's all I'm going to say about this model, now I want to move on to something that's more, oh, sorry, there's a question up there.
How g of x is dependent on rho.
Didn't understand how g of x is dependent on
Rho.
rho. Yeah. Notice that g of x right here is defined in terms of the top compensation, w of x here, which is compensation as a function of x, which we already know is identified. And down the bottom, we've just got the expected value of this exponential of rho and w of x. In other words, everything is identified here apart from rho. So you give me a rho, I can tell you what g of x is. Intuitively, the argument is from that compensation contract, I'm looking at how that guy is optimizing, and then I'm saying, okay, that must mean that the likelihood ratio is, and that's what I get. Okay. That intuition is going to follow through in this dynamic setup. And here I want to move to a real application. I shouldn't say real application. The model that when you estimate a model that I've just talked about and add hidden information, you get that on those measures, the firm loss, depending on the size, is about 5% per year, in terms of returns. The benefit to the agent is maybe a few $100,000. And the amount that the principal is willing to pay for a perfect monitor is maybe a little bit more than a few $100,000. Okay, there's a reason why these guys don't try and monitor these guys perfectly. It's not worth it. You can pay them sometimes millions, sometimes less. Yet paying them what we call the risk premium, because you're giving them an uncertain wage instead of a certain wage. And the question is, how much more do you have to pay them? Well, the estimate that you get out of these kinds of models, and I've done a few of them now, is that you present suppose you were to present a CEO with one of these guys. I realize not many of us in this room are like that, but one of these guys with the option of, okay, you're going to get $1 million 50% of the time, and you get $3 million 50% of the time. And I'm going to ask you, and we can do this with a second price option. So would you prefer this? I haven't done it. Would you prefer this to, or not, to something that's certain? What are you indifferent between? What's your certainty equivalent? And the answer coming out of these kinds of studies is about $1.8 million. In other words, they're willing to sacrifice $200,000 in order to get a certainty equivalent that offers the choice between a lottery of 1.8 versus, 1 versus 3. And that's about, I won't say that's about right or not. It's hard to get anything out of these managers that's truthful, except when they're really dealing with stuff that counts. But the basic point is that lottery is not outrageous in the sense that the average wage for compensation for these guys, expected wage, if you look across the top ranks, is in the order of a few million. A couple of million is not such a bad benchmark to start from. Maybe it'll be about 4 million by the time this inflation bout's over. But in any event, that's what you get out of this static model. If you turn it into a dynamic model, some of the numbers change a little bit, but not hugely. So that gives you some idea. Okay, want to move to I guess questions if there are any. Yeah, go ahead.
This is kind of like an out there question. With this type of a model, can you make a statement like without principal agent issues in firms, GDP would be X% higher or something like that? Like try to connect this problem to like economic output.
Yeah, sure. So the output that you get out of this model is what would happen to the firms. how much would they depreciate? And we're talking about public corporations here as opposed to private corporations. And one thing it doesn't do is deal with public corporations turning into private corporations. And of course, that's exactly what's going on with things like SOX and Dodd-Frank. More regulations on public corporations lead to decline in overall stock market and more private corporations now than before. So this model doesn't take into account that. It's basically saying that in this situation, if you looked at these public corporations, they would shrink in terms of value quite a lot. And the amount that they would shrink is sort of comparable to, in a very rough sort of way, to the kind of stuff that we saw in Central and Eastern Europe after with the end of socialism. And so there wasn't contracting going on, and you see a whole lot of stuff going bad. So that's the sense in which this is pretty serious, and that the more anecdotal stuff on the very few occasions that I've been employed as an expert witness, they basically tell me, we don't really care how much we pay you. What they pay me is nothing compared to the value of what it is to them to get me to say, I won't say what they want me to say, but to get me to testify in these kinds of situations. Yeah.
So the numbers you just talked about,
yeah,
you got those from fixing some rule, right? Because
well, okay, the numbers that we got that I talked about just then come from two kinds of sources. One is a fully parametric version of the model, and there what we did was we AER and also earlier IER. We estimated F with a truncated normal and the shirking distribution with a truncated normal as well. There's one other source of identification that I haven't talked, and so we estimated rho along with that parametric. There's one other source of identification that I haven't mentioned, and I probably should now, which is as you change the interest rate or the bond price, the agent thinks about consumption smoothing in a little different way, because that's the price of current consumption versus future consumption. So you are implicitly changing the lotteries that he's facing. Okay, we're still going to have all these constraints holding, but you're basically putting the agent in different worlds by changing the bond price. And so that gives you some variation in what we'll call the lotteries that these guys are facing. It's not up there because it's a static model. It will be up there in a minute. And so that gives you additional kind of constraints, okay? And so in the two frameworks that I have just referred to now, as opposed to a third one, you have those additional sources of variation to get the lottery. And in one other paper, the RE Stud paper with George, 2015, we just look at the set identification. We don't go to the point parametric identification and just look at the set of things that occur. And it's it really is a set. It's not as if it's a point. And I was just giving you a ballpark number, which fits into that set, okay? Move on. Yes.
When you go dynamic, can your measurement error incorporate zero correlation?
Can the measurement error
Can the measurement error not be IID, can it be serially correlated?
in the compensation?
Yeah.
In the compensation, maybe. We haven't done it yet, but I think it's possible. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Well, maybe we should talk about it now. So if it's serially correlated, the error itself, but that's all you have to worry about, not really a problem, because you're really talking about what is the wage equation here. The key is whether that epsilon actually has anything to do with the real contract. Okay, that's the problem, or that's where the problems arise. And once you start to impound the wage equation over and above the X inside the optimization problem as well, you can't get the WX out separately. And so you've got to worry about how you would do that. And that would significantly complicate the problem. So serial correlation, not an issue. Correlation between the epsilons and the X's, haha, that's different. Now, if you had some instruments, fine, where are you going to get them from? That's coming back to some of the stuff that we said in a more general way yesterday. Okay. Keep going. Yep. All right, just a minute. Here we have, we're going to let this guy borrow and save with changes in the interest rate helping us. I already talked about that. Here's another point I want to make. We are going to assume that people can trade on contingent claims for consumption in the future, as in a narrow Debreu world, except with respect to the markets that we are explicitly modeling. In this case, it's just the moral hazard market. Now, this is almost anathema to anybody who was trained at, say, Columbia. Joseph Stiglitz came to mind. Because in that situation, it's like, why on earth would you think that a social planner competitive equilibrium, or whatever is out there in the real world, replicates a social planning problem? Because there are all kinds of things that prevent markets from working. And of course, I'm coming from originally Chicago and still with that kind of bent. And my response to these guys is, well, maybe, but we already know from Sonnenschein type results, and there are a bunch of other people that have done this, Debreu, that demand curves can slope any which way. And so how are you going to tell me from your partial equilibrium framework what we should be doing when we're trying to regulate or deregulate industries unless you have some kind of underlying basis? Which is an uncomfortable statement to make, because we're all pretty, speaking for myself, ignorant about what is really going on. And so competitive equilibrium is a benchmark that's useful for kind of shoving everything under the blanket and saying the room looks tidy. So that is sort of what's going on here. In order to focus on a moral hazard problem in an optimal contract setting, we're imagining that these managers can save and borrow as much as they want. In practice, for this particular group of people, they probably are saving over the time that they are managers. I sent my kid to private school some years ago, and I was much younger than I am now. And one of the first things he said to me was, how come you're still working, Dad? All the other guys that send their kids to private schools had already retired at 40, okay? In other words, there's saving that goes on. They get these jobs, they last about 5 to 6 years as CEOs, that's about the average. And from then on out, it's like their wealth is probably declining, or maybe it's not clear exactly what goes on. So that's the sense in which these are fairly sophisticated people. They know what financial markets look like. That's what they deal with. They're probably saving anyway. So if we're going to make a competitive equilibrium assumption, this is probably the group to start with. So, but it's something to worry about, okay? In other words, if you're thinking about where does this market fit in relation to other markets, how do we model what we'll call the background? So they are choosing, this agent is choosing between alternative sources of employment. And so that's the sense in which they're choosing between different lotteries. And in this dynamic setting, there's going to be one principal, bunch of agents, each one having several employment choices. And at the same time, they're accumulating human capital in terms of experience. So it's still pretty simple in terms of how that human capital is being accumulated. I'll relax some of that on Saturday, Friday. But we're just by being around, they learn about stuff, okay? And we'll use the same three measures to, after we've estimated this model. And the main purpose of this exercise is to ask, why is it that executives in large firms are paid more than those in small firms? The usual explanation is, well, it must be preferences. I don't know why economists always jump to the, it must be preferences, or maybe they're not rational. Please kill the analysis before you start. No. The issue is, are there any other factors that are explaining what's going on? Gary Becker, look at your budget constraint first, and then ask, can we explain it in terms of the opportunities that these people face, recognizing that humans, for the most part, are almost identical to each other. They just have different backgrounds. Compare that with machines, which are all kinds of things all over the place, okay? The difference between machines and humans doesn't even right. Okay, here's the data. Comes from a publicly available data set, so it's available to all of you guys. Execucom. Now, this data we are updating right now in the work we're doing, but the empirical results that I'll show you come from just 1992-2006, and that's true for the rest of this week. Decent size, 16,300. That's down from 30,000 once you get all their background stuff. And we've got data on their compensation and what we call interlock status, I'll talk about later, age, gender, education, transitions. And just to give you some kind of notion of what this market looks like, exit rate is between 12 and 18% per year. Let me tell you what I mean by exit rate. Where you have to report to the SEC if you're one of the top 5 executives. And actually, a lot of companies, some companies, report more than the top 5 or 6. They want the SEC to do their monitoring against fraud for them. And so there's a sense in which there's a capture thing going on. You think the SEC is protecting the public. No, the company itself doesn't need to have a reputation because they can get the government to do it by punishing people that commit fraud, and that's useful, okay? I got the wrong audience to say this kind of stuff, but you can imagine how I put it to my MBAs. So the turnover here is between 2 and 3%, much lower than the exit rate, okay? You can see the age, and we're talking 51 and 54. And so the guys at my private school retired even earlier than that. And then on average, they have about 13 to 14 years tenure in business. So there's notion that executives at the top pop around between different companies is really wrong. Most of them just grow up. There's a little bit of turnover here. Got it somewhere 1 to 3 firms over their executive lifetime or even longer. They have about 17 years of executive experience. So you sort of half see it from that. 13 to 14 as executive and only 3 extra years as an executive somewhere else. Most of them have college, and a lot of them have MBAs. Good thing we're in Sloan. And total aren't we? And then total compensation, you can see between 1.5 and 4.5 million, and it increases in firm size. That gives you a little bit of a snapshot. And you might want to go to your own slides here, because I realize this is a little, today I realize a little bit faded here. But we've ranked people, and this just shows the number of people in different ranks in small, medium, and large firms. We've just classified them. We classified them by industry for the purpose of the estimation. I'm not sure. Oh yes, here you can see the salary here. Here's the salary. Here's the total pay. So most of the total pay is coming from stuff other than salary. All right. In fact, the earlier studies on this said salary tends to go down or is barely more or less flat in times when the firm does well, and reverses in times when it does badly. They seem to get paid more or about the same amount, okay, in salary and bonus. Simple point is, when executives are making their contracts, they have obviously information. So it's not just moral hazard going on. They also have information about the firm that we don't have. And basically the shareholders are paying to get that information. And the way they get that information is to say, look, here's your bonus if the firm does well. And of course, this reveals to them what the kind of bets are. And so the executives want to take more uncertain stuff when the firm subsequently does well. And in fact, this is a pretty big thing that we've partly dealt with in one of our papers, not with the one I'm showing you now. We estimate in one of the other stuff that, and we're not sure about this because it's so dramatic, that if you look at what you would get if you were able to manage your own portfolio by seeing when managers decided to take firm stock and options versus salary, and you copied them at the time, which is sort of impossible, but if you could, that would be risk-free because you're doing it across different firms, okay? And so you could still diversify. And so there's no risk premium attached to you doing that. The problem is you can't do it fast enough because the firm's shares react to when these guys see it. And so that's why that's why you can't capitalize on it. But if you could, okay, in this counterfactual, over that period, the share prices rose at about 10%. The return was about 10%. If you could do it perfectly, knowing exactly what the firms were doing, because you could see what the firms were doing, and you had some kind of capital constraints, so you couldn't invest too much, you could make up to 20%. And if you could just copy the managers and see what they were doing, you would make 18%. It's huge. In other words, they were able to extract a fair bit of what they thought the firms were able to do when it suited them as a way of providing I'm going to say, a diagnosis to shareholders about what's wrong, okay? When you go to a builder or a doctor, you are partly paying for the diagnosis because if he does the wrong thing, that's incredibly costly. And so in a generalized model, you would want to think about hidden information as well as moral hazard. We've done that in the RE stud paper, but not including human capital. And so that's an obvious place where future research could be done. So 3 factors playing a basic role here, not the hidden information that I was just talking about then. In terms of human capital, executives tend to be, large firms tend to be older, more educated, less executive experience because they've got slightly more education. And so this is the old Mincer model in which somebody who gets more educated has less experience, another Columbia person, has more education, then less experience since then. And then there's an overtaking age, of course. they end up in this case, they end up for whatever reason in larger firms versus smaller firms. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is working as executives increases your compensation. That's probably an experience thing that's going on. And we can see that that actually counts. The other side of it, I said 3 basic factors, but I've only listed 2 here, I guess. Top executives are paid total compensation in the form of stock and options. It's risky because not only are they paid that, but they also hold a lot of that. And so this is where the negative compensation is coming from. They're holding a lot of stuff in their own firm, and sometimes they take a hit. And that the hit that they take on the financial securities that they hold in their own firm completely outweighs all the other stuff. And that's why they get negative compensation in some places. And what you see is that people are more and more leveraged as they climb up the executive ladder. In other words, they're more and more leveraged to the firm. Now, part of that might be that down in the lower ranks, you can see what they do more easily. And so you can pay them a flat wage, because the alternative is, well, you either engage in a civil suit if they sabotage the firm, or you just fire them if they don't. And you have a contract that's easy to enforce. There's not much moral hazard. Up in the upper ranks, it's harder to tell exactly what these guys do. And so in that sense, because you can't see what they're doing, you more or less have to gear what they get to the output of the firm. And so that's probably what's explaining that. So here's the model. All clear with the model, or any general questions before I start the model? So,
there was a question over there.
oh, sorry, I missed it.
Yeah, Professor, just a question about the feedback rate between executive characteristics and, like, for large firms, these people are chosen to reassure shareholders. You have big financial institutions on the board, right? So, how do we think about the feedback between their characteristics responding to versus influencing share prices?
Okay. In this framework that I'm going to talk about now, we've set it up so that managers extract everything. And so firms are only going to get what we'll call shareholders are only going to get a normal return. So that's one thing we're doing. I'll talk about what we're missing in a minute, but what's in the model first. And not only that, we're going to have an additive technology. And so there won't be a whole lot of interaction between different types of managers as they think about who should we hire now. There's a little bit of team production, which I'll get to in a minute. But for the most part, we're just thinking about extending the Roy model, which essentially has hunters and fishermen doing their own things in their own ponds and forests and whatever, not affecting, or buses individually doing stuff, not affecting other buses in the fleet, not affecting anything else that's going on. And so that's the sense in which we're ducking some of the issues that you're talking about. Of course, we still have things like demographics and stuff like that influencing it. And so anybody can be a CEO in this company, in this world that I'm going to present now. However, with the wrong kind of demographics, in inverted commas, that'll mean that you get paid much worse than someone with the right demographics, which probably has something to do with the reason why I'm an academic as opposed to a smooth talking executive. So that is what's going on in the model. I think that it's very clear that companies do choose top people for jobs in different ways as the firm goes through different cycles. And that sets up a different type of bargaining game that goes on in terms of sharing the rent. Here, the managers are getting it all. Anecdotal story. An first Australian of McDonald's, CEO, started out at the very bottom, probably a suburb in Sydney, swore all his life that hamburgers and stuff like that from McDonald's was incredibly nutritious. You didn't need to have anything else. When asked what he would do to a rival if he saw that rival drowning, his response was shove a hose down the rival's throat. He became, not all Australians are like that. He became CEO, died 2 years later of cancer. Well, we know what his diet was like. And we know how committed he was. He was a good CEO, drove McDonald's in the period that he was there, but extracted personal toll in a big way. Actually, they live pretty stressful lives, and that's why they don't last that long. So that gives you some sense of a very, I don't know, out in the tail example of how shareholders and the board thinks about the right type of person at the right time to match what they want. It's almost impossible to really get a good feel that we can use in data to get at that bargaining problem, but it's there. Okay. Keep going. So this is missing a lot of those factors. Can you get anything out of it anyway? Well, and how are your estimates likely to be biased? Because you don't catch everything. You've got these guys moving to new firms or sticking with the same firm, and they're and then they can retire. So these are all the choices that you face. You're accumulating tenure at your own firm, and also while you're with it, or if you quit, you start again at somebody else's firm, or you quit and you all together. And so we have human capital accumulating in this fairly mechanical way. They're getting utility from consumption. Their utility also depends on some fairly basic demographics. The alpha and the beta have the same signs as before now, but now I'm just subscripting by, did you change, which rank did you choose and what type of firm did you choose if you stayed with the firm, okay? These I won't talk about the rankings now, but they essentially start up from a relatively low to CEO right out to president within the firm. Chair, excuse me. There's a taste shock that's privately observed by the worker, by the executive. And so you can see that apart from the exponential term, see that it's E to here's consumption, and then you've got this epsilon shock, and then you've got these choices here. Notice that only one of these terms is going to count. All of the others are going to be zero. So you're choosing what level, where you work. That's the D and the L stuff. And so really just one of these terms is going to be the only thing that counts. Everything's going to zero out. See, here are the choices over types of firm and also types of worker. As I said, markets work well for everything else. I said before in response to a question that production technology is sort of additive. In other words, each person is getting something that's related to what they can extract in the competitive world for this. Could be related to the value of marginal product, if you like, but not just that. There's a stock market return. Okay. Here's the value of the firm. The production is how much does the value of the firm increase due to what we'll call aggregate factors. And then there's how much does the value of the firm increase due to the abnormal return in the firm. Okay. If we're thinking about how these guys, how the firm does, then we're thinking about how well does the firm do relative to some reference set. That reference set could be the stock market, or it might alternatively be other firms in the industry. That might be another reference set to think about. How well did this firm do? In other words, what should we be compensating the CEO for? Probably relative to either the stock market or the industry return, something like that. In this work, we're just looking at relative to the stock index. It wouldn't make that much difference if we did it relative to industry. There's an issue of the extent to which firms cooperate with each other, and hence the executives, by getting on with each other, can get rent. Obviously, in some industry, agricultural industries, for example, in the States, that would be a big deal. So this is the kind of thing that is going to lead to the executive being compensated more or less. It's not just what it's not just the return on the firm security, it's the return on the firm security less the benchmark return, for example, on the stock market. Now, in this setup, everyone's going to be motivated to work because, again, we're looking at people who really don't get a flat wage, but really are compensated according to the return, this idiosyncratic or abnormal return on the firm. And it's going to be higher if everybody works. And if everybody works but me, I'm one of those executives, I wish, then the return is going to be lower. Notice that I haven't put here what would happen if everybody shirked or two people shirked. Well, we're going to look at what is essentially a Nash equilibrium condition. And in that Nash equilibrium, everyone's been thinking about working. And so when you're considering as an executive your best reply, you're asking, given the equilibrium behavior of everybody else working, should I shirk or not? And so the person setting the optimal contract is doing the same thing. He's thinking, okay, that's how he's going to do the calculus. And in other words, the person who's setting the contract is thinking these managers are not going to band together, which is a question as to whether they might or not, because in that sense is a limitation of the model, because we're only looking at a Nash equilibrium instead of looking at something in which two people deviate or more than one person deviates, okay? Leave that for a minute, for now. And in that situation, all you're ever going to observe, given that people are incentivized to work, is a compensation schedule that reflects them thinking about, each person individually thinking about, oh, maybe I should shirk, maybe I shouldn't, okay? Similar to the prototype model that I began with in the first part of this lecture. So everybody knows their H, they privately observe their epsilon, they're thinking about whether they should continue or not. That epsilon could include all kinds of stuff, but related, for example, the epsilon 0 is what's my domestic situation like? Is it really worth going on? Health, stuff like that. You select a firm and a position. This is coming back to Anna's question. Submit a compensation proposal. It's like, hey, this is what it's going to cost you. And if you, again, going back to the building thing, the guy who's doing your contract looks over your house, and so we keep our yard in a particularly shitty position with condition with no lawns mowed and stuff like that, hoping that it'll help me. That's my excuse for not mowing the lawn. I'll get you. And then they submit a contract to you, and as a householder, I say, well, do I take that contract or not? Yeah,
So all of this analysis is conditional on the CEO getting selected, but there might be certain reasons for why there was a CEO change.
okay. In this setup, each of the executives decides what they want to do individually. And so you're right, this is a ROI model in which you decide what you want to do. And so one of the sort of completely unrealistic things it has about it is potentially you could have two people deciding to be the CEO of the same firm. Okay, we have not included anything about that team interaction stuff as to how they get formed. And that really goes into a question of how do we deal with networks in this kind of situation? Hardly touch it. Okay, so yes, and that's how. So there's principles are not deciding anything in this model. They're just being, the shareholders are simply getting, if you like, an optimal contract from the managers who present themselves. And if the manager were to say, I'll give you something that's non-optimal, or doesn't satisfy some constraints, by the direct revelation principle, the principal would know what was really going on and say, no, I don't want you. You have to present something that's either a direct mechanism or equivalent to a direct mechanism. You can lie to me if you want, but I know what you're going to do. And so I work it out from there. Okay. So getting at what you...
Yeah, but I was still wondering, is there any term in this model that accounts for the firm level selection? Like there are certain firms that change CEOs, which are different from other firms that don't change CEOs. Like the CEO turnover is...
No, is the short answer. And I'd only qualify it by saying, clearly there's still turnover in this framework because it depends on things like industry, demographics of the manager and stuff like that. But it's all sort of exogenous. And in that sense, no. And that's why I'm saying need stuff to do with teamwork or something like that in order to be able to get at that kind of question in a better way. So it's not that the data, of course the data handles it, but it handles it without dealing with it within the economic model. Okay. Okay, so yeah, that's the setup. Now we'll define something that's pretty close to a continuation value. It's called, I'm going to call it human capital. Notice that this human capital is defined in terms of conditional choice probabilities down here. Okay, those conditional choice probabilities are reflecting optimal choices that are going to be made in the future that in turn come from the evaluation function. At this point, I've just recursively defined this thing. It should have had 3 bars there, I guess. And the epsilons is the value of the private disturbance, conditional on the person accepting with the star, conditional on the person accepting a particular type of job. So it's the selected epsilon. And we're asking, how does that human capital evolve? And what's it, how do we value it? Well, it's straightforward, a little short on time here. So I'll just say that lower values of A are associated with higher values of human capital. And the way to see that is to get that V thing substituted out for the W. And when you push up the W, you'll see that the A goes down. Okay, so that's where that A is coming from. Remember, we're talking about an exponential utility, which is negative anyway. And so we're always talking about trying to get as close to 0 in terms of your utility. And that, again, is sort of a little bit of motivation for the A. And so what you can show is that we can write down the value function in the following way. before we even talk about it too much, notice that this is almost a standard dynamic programming problem at this point, because the A has this recursive feature. The H's are just to do with how human capital is going to evolve. So that's like the X or the state variables next period. See the T+1 there. This is telling you how H is going to evolve if you take JK. And then you've got some returns here this is the compensation here. So we're thinking about, well, what is the expected return when I take JK and then work maybe and work in this case? What sort of choices should I make in this where retirement is an option? Okay, retirement is an option, and I'm asking, how as an agent would I solve this problem if I know what I'm going to be doing in the future periods going to be non-optimally behaving? And then we've got these alpha benefit, these case parameters, given that I'm working. So in other words, given that I'm incentivized, and in the equilibrium you will be incentivized, given that I'm incentivized, what is the optimization problem that I'm solving? Okay. So at this point we say, okay, we already know that we can there's this inversion. We can talk about just there's the optimization problem sitting there, and now the conditional value function associated with that from yesterday. And so there's a Q function that exists. And by definition, that Q function is just the threshold epsilon, the difference between the threshold epsilons of taking two different types of jobs relative to, say, retiring. So we can work out straight away what the certainty equivalent wage would be in this setup, because to get that certainty equivalence wage, we ask, well, what's going to give the guy the same utility, given that he's paid a certain wage? Okay, so just take the expectation out of this after equating with Q, and then just solving for that, you get the certainty equivalent wage is equal to, well, there's something associated with the distaste for working hard. There's something associated with human capital that you're going to get out of this by taking that job. And there's also something associated with the difference in the epsilons, that's the Q piece. And that is related to the idea that the firm, and this to some extent answers the question that you had up the top, about those epsilon demands, which is really saying those epsilons to some extent reflect the demands for the company and what they're willing to pay in order to attract someone into a given position in this period. And the idea is that if those epsilons are really low for this guy, the fact that he takes the job must mean that he was offered a whole lot more for it. And so that's the sense in which there is passive offsetting that makes this part of a bigger model without actually solving for it. Okay. So these are what we'll call temporary demands or idiosyncratic or demands by the firm for a particular person, because this is idiosyncratic to the individual. So one period contracts are optimal in this setup. Notice the bond prices are in here now, and that's just because the guy is smoothing, and I see I've just got 1 minute. This guy is smoothing. So we can also see that if we took the expectation away, this thing would be, and you set this to be an equality, you would see that this is what this boils down to, 1, and alpha on beta is always greater than 1. So that's the sense in which you get this moral hazard applying. You get this cost minimizing contract in the same way as I did that prototype model early on, by just the principal minimizing. It's a 1 period contract, it's optimal, as I just said. So I'm not going to go through it. We have except I've got a risk premium now written down explicitly to deal with it. I didn't bother writing it down for in the prototype model. And then the other terms, as I've just described, free entry in this setup. Now we're just now in this setup, we've got these different libraries. I'm assuming point identification. And so we go through construct a methods of moments estimator. I'm thinking that we're less than a minute here. If we look at the risk premium and the expected pay, we'll see the risk premium that these guys are paid is almost equal to expected pay. In other words, a certainty equivalent is only a few $100,000 for these guys when you talk about a risk aversion parameter of the type that I described earlier. Maybe $1 million, but that's sort of what we're talking about. And then you can break down things into what counts as human capital, where is the non-pecuniary aspects to this. I won't do that now. Looking at the gross loss, is coming to an earlier question about the aggregate effects here. I'm a minute over time. All right, oh, thank you. Thanks. You can see from this, here's the value of the large firms, the value of the small firms. You can see that the loss in equity for large firms is way more than, is way less as a proportion of firm size than for small firms. That's one of the things that this graph shows. In other words, if there was more agglomeration rather than less, there would be, the moral hazard cost would actually go down in terms of the cost of the firms, which is a kind of interesting result because Burley Means tells us the opposite. It's large firms that are really inefficiently organized, etc. The reason why you don't have as much agglomeration in firms or concentration is for other things, not because managers falling over each other trying to extract stuff from the shareholders. That's not what's going on. That's what this is just saying. And the other kind of things like the other kind of factors, I think, and I've already mentioned it before. One point that is worth mentioning, though, is that if we're talking about the degree of control managers have, what this graph shows, again, I'll just have to explain it just a little bit to you, is that the CEOs only send out a pretty rough signal of what's going on. This is what's suggesting that, in fact, shareholders can't tell very much about what CEOs are doing. And that's why this likelihood ratio tends to be flatter for people that are in higher positions. And it's you know, if you knew exactly what it was going on, it would be an L shape. When they're shirking, it's 1, and when they're working, it's infinity, 1, and then infinity, if they're working, it would be 0. It's relatively flat for high guys, and that's why they're compensating, giving so much of their compensation in terms of stock and options. So, last slide. This is essentially, in words, what these results show. First of all, large firms employ more talented, in the sense of more educated, more experienced executives. No hypothesis, no support for hypothesis that executives prefer working in small firms. Actually, they get paid to work in small firms. They're willing to work for a large firm for less, maybe network effects that we haven't taken account of. We're not sure, of course. No firm premium for human capital. In other words, working for a large firm doesn't help you get more human capital. 80% of firm compensation comes from the risk premium. It's huge. And the remaining 20% comes from demand. And I should stop.
Okay, well, thank you.